But with that said, let's get to the topic of the day. And the topic of the day is that the first college football playoff rankings were released. And for people who forget, for people who don't remember the cycle, this is all pretty simple, pretty self-explanatory. Every single year around this time, the people that are in charge of picking the 4 teams for the college football playoff, they start putting out a weekly poll. And on the one hand, it really doesn't matter, right? It all sorts itself out over the final 4 or 5 weeks of the season. It's all a little bit for TV and for song and dance and kind of just to create interest in the college football playoff. It's so guys like me will yell and scream about it. But what I would say is the first poll was released on Tuesday. And I do believe that this year it was genuinely important, unlike in years past, okay? So in some years, I do think that it is just kind of a TV show and you kind of know who's going to be there and it's kind of for song and dance. And like I said, it all sorts itself out in the end. But I did believe that there were 2 reasons that this year the first poll was really important and was really going to reflect what the narratives were potentially for the next 5 or so weeks until we get that Final Four on the first week of December after the college football playoff Final Four is announced. The first one, where is Cincinnati, right? Cincinnati is top 5 in every human poll, the AP poll, the coaches poll. They're top 5, but where are they in the playoff committee's eyes? Because if they start too far down, 1, they can't make up enough ground, and 2, it obviously puts it in a situation where, of course, other teams can eventually surpass them if they get enough good wins. So 1, where is Cincinnati? And 2, Oregon and Ohio State. So both teams have 1 loss. Ohio State's loss is to Oregon. Oregon's loss is much worse, but again, with each team having 1 loss, what does it matter or who is ahead of them? Because it does matter. Because if Oregon was ranked behind Ohio State coming out of Tuesday night, there was essentially no way that they could realistically ever jump Ohio State because they're not going to have games as good as Ohio State's down the stretch. So to me, those were 2 very important storylines. We got our top 10, and let's talk about it a little bit. First of all, let's rip through the top 10. This is the college football playoff poll, and again, this is always subject to change. This will change over the coming weeks as games are played. But here is the top 10 according to the College Football Playoff Committee. Number 10 is Notre Dame. Number 9 is undefeated Wake Forest. Number 8, the first real shocker, was Oklahoma all the way down at number 8. Number 7 was Michigan coming off the loss to Michigan State. Number 6 was Cincinnati. Number 5 was Ohio State. Number 4 was Oregon. Number 3 was Michigan State, and number 2 was Alabama. Number 1, in the least surprising news ever, was Georgia. So let's get into it. Let's break it down. I basically have 4 kind of big takeaways, okay? And on the one hand, I know what you guys are going to say. None of it matters. It'll all work itself out. It'll all figure itself out. Torres, don't yell and scream. Well, as I've told you for years, my old radio partner Arnie Spanner used to say, the show is tonight. Well, this happened tonight, and I have to react tonight to what has happened. And let me start with my 4 big takeaways from the College Football Playoff Committee release. The first one, Alabama at number 2 is an absolute abomination, okay? And if you want proof that SEC bias exists, if you want proof that Alabama, there is favoritism there, look no further than Alabama being at number 2. As I joked on Twitter, my sister always used to say, Mom loves you more than me. And I said, that's ridiculous. That is impossible. There's no world where Mom loves me more than she loves you. She loves us all equally. Well, now I know what she's talking about because Bama has no business being number 2 in the college football playoff poll. And on the one part, again, I get it. None of it really matters. If Alabama wins out, they are going to the college football playoff. That would obviously involve them beating Auburn. It would involve them beating Georgia in the college football or in the SEC championship game. If they lose to Georgia, if they lose to Auburn, they might not even go to the SEC championship game. And if they lose to Georgia, if they take a second loss, they probably won't go to the college football playoff at all. At the same time, what I would also say is this. The College Football Playoff Committee's job is to rank teams right now based on who they are and where they should be. It should not matter what your name is. It should not matter what you did last year. It shouldn't matter what the recruiting rankings are. And it shouldn't matter what Vegas says you would do on a neutral field to anybody else. And I am just telling you, right now, there is no way that Alabama should be number 2 in college football, okay? So let me run through Alabama's resume right now as we speak. Alabama's resume is as follows. They beat a really bad Miami team early in the season. Ironically, Miami's playing better now than they were back when they played Alabama. Alabama ripped off wins against Mercer, wins against Southern Miss in the out-of-conference. They beat Florida by 2 on the road at the Swamp. They were outscored 26-10 over the final 3 quarters of that game. Unimpressive win. Hold on for dear life. As it turns out, Florida State, by the way, is currently 4-4. On top of that, they beat Ole Miss. Good win, solid win, whatever. Lane Kiffin coached them out of that game. We all know it. Lose to Texas A&M, beat Mississippi State, beat Tennessee in a game where it was a one-possession game early in the fourth quarter. And so let me say that again to explain why I am frustrated that Alabama is number 2 in this college football playoff poll. They beat 3 teams that aren't very good out of conference, the best one being Miami. Miami is actually playing better after De'Aaron King got hurt of late. They beat Florida by 2 in a game they needed a goal line stand. They beat Ole Miss in a game where Lane Kiffin gave them the game. And they struggled against Tennessee that had a quarterback that was essentially playing on one leg in Hendon Hooker. They have played one game that I would say is a complete wire-to-wire domination. That was against Mississippi State. Good for them. And other than that, their resume is bleh. So I already know what you're thinking. Now, Torres, what does it even matter? And by the way, who would you even have ahead of Alabama? Why are you so worked up? If they lose, it won't matter. That is true. But at the same time, what you have done on the field has to matter, or it should matter, or it is the right thing that it matters. And I don't think that's being taken into account when it comes to Alabama. If we're just talking about strictly on-the-field resume, Michigan State should no doubt, in my mind, be ranked ahead of Alabama. Michigan State has a top 10 win. By the way, Michigan State's best out-of-conference win was at Miami. They beat Miami just as much on the road in a true road game as Alabama did beat Miami on a neutral field. Beyond that, I would also say, unpopular opinion, we're going to talk about Cincinnati in a minute, I would have Cincinnati ranked ahead of Alabama. Not to say that if Alabama runs the table, they can't pass them, but it's supposed to matter what has happened on the field so far. Cincinnati's win at Notre Dame is significantly more impressive than anything Alabama has done. I'm sorry, but it's the truth. You can debate it. You can argue it. I would say if it's strictly about eye test, I would put Ohio State over Alabama. I think Ohio State, for the most part, since they've lost to Oregon, has looked like a much more complete football team. That loss to Oregon by Ohio State lit a fire under them, and they have been awesome since. Alabama loses to Texas A&M. 2 weeks later, they're struggling to put away Tennessee. So I don't want to yell. I don't want to scream. I don't want to keep going, and I do understand that it is going to play themselves out. But in my opinion, I do not believe that it was the right decision to put Alabama at number 2. At some point, they may get there. At some point, they may prove it. If they go to Auburn, they play Auburn, and they beat them by 30, that changes the conversation. I get that. But what we have to do right now is take what we know, and you cannot argue that Alabama should be ranked ahead of Michigan State, and I will argue they should not be ranked ahead of Cincinnati. Speaking of Cincinnati, let's get to them. They are my number 2 takeaway, and again, I thought it was a really interesting and really important dynamic where Cincinnati was ranked early in this poll. You start to rank them 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, they're probably not going to be able to get enough wins to pass them. And so in many ways, I think being ranked number 5 for Cincinnati actually is a good thing. Now, I will also say it's a little bit of a disappointing thing as well. In terms of the good thing, I've seen people point it out, this is the highest that Cincinnati, the highest that any group of 5 team, non-power 5 team has been ranked in the initial playoff poll. So that certainly does help their cause. But what I would also say is, first of all, they're undefeated. Second of all, again, their win at Notre Dame is better than anything on, I would argue, Georgia's resume. I'm not saying they should be ahead of Georgia because Georgia's awesome. Love my dogs. How about my dogs? Love my dogs. Not saying they should be ranked ahead of Georgia, but I would argue it's more impressive than anything on Georgia's resume. It's more impressive than anything on Ohio State's resume, who's ahead of them. And it's more impressive than anything on Alabama's resume, ranked ahead of them. So one, they actually have a resume that warrants being even higher than number 5, okay? And that's the big thing, because I don't understand how you can be a Cincinnati fan and even at number 5 not be frustrated. And it's for 2 very specific reasons. The first one, it's because for years, last year, if you remember, and I'll never forget because I did the rants on these shows, every week Cincinnati, They wouldn't play. They'd get dropped down. They'd win. They'd get dropped down. It didn't matter what they did. And last year, the committee had the get-out-of-jail-free card, the excuse of saying, well, they didn't play anybody out of conference that mattered. Because, of course, last year there were essentially no out-of-conference games. Well, this year, they did exactly what the committee wanted. They went to Notre Dame, got a win against Notre Dame that is a top 10 win. That is not my opinion. That is a fact according to the committee. Again, Cincinnati's win at Notre Dame is more impressive than anything on Alabama's resume or anything on Ohio State's resume. So why are those two teams ranked ahead of Cincinnati? The other thing that would concern me if I'm a Cincinnati fan, and again, if you want to argue the totality of what Ohio State has done is so much more impressive, I'm kind of having trouble buying that. I mean, at least Alabama has wins over Ole Miss and Mississippi State. Ohio State's best win is against Penn State, which, Penn State ain't looking too good right now. You look at where these rankings are. Ohio State beat Rutgers, Indiana, and Maryland. They're not in this top 25 anywhere. Penn State isn't in this top 25 anywhere. So right now, Ohio State doesn't even have a single win. So one, you can't even argue that Ohio State deserves it because they play in the Big Ten. Maybe in 2 or 3 weeks if they beat Michigan and Michigan State. But right now, I don't believe they deserve to be ranked ahead of Cincinnati. Cincinnati went out, beat Notre Dame, did what they told you to do. The second reason I would be concerned if I'm a Cincinnati fan, and this is where I would be terrified. The committee, yeah, it's kind of like a carrot right in front of their nose. Oh, you're ranked number 5. You're ranked number 5. Good for you guys. Just keep winning. You'll have yourself a chance to play yourselves in. Just one problem. You can already see the scenario where the committee is kind of angling to make sure that they stay out. And what do I mean by that? The committee has already kind of set up things, checks and balances, barriers to make sure that teams can either surpass them that are behind them, or more importantly, the teams in front of them can even lose and still stay in front of them. What do I mean by that? Let's take Michigan State. They're at number 3. Think they should be number 2. They're number 3, whatever. Imagine if Michigan State 2 weeks from now plays Ohio State. I think it's actually 3 weeks, but you get the point. They play Ohio State and they lose. Ohio State's ranked number 5. Michigan State's ranked number 3, and Michigan State takes the L. Guess what happens? Now the committee can say, Cincinnati, we know the team in front of you lost, but look at who they lost to. We can't really move them behind you because, come on, look at what they just did. They just lost to Ohio State. Ohio State's good. Remember, we told you they're ahead of them. Kind of the same with Ohio State. In theory, Ohio State could lose to Michigan State. It could still be seen as a good loss. I don't know if I believe that. But then they're in Alabama, by the way, the same. On top of that, what I would also say, you can kind of see the scenario. Can't you kind of see it where the teams behind Cincinnati can move ahead of them? You know who I'm specifically talking about? Oklahoma. I think the committee, they certainly did Oklahoma no favors putting them at number 8. We'll talk about that in a minute. But if you look at the top 25, you know who's right outside the top 25? Or outside of the top 10, excuse me? Well, let's take a quick look. You want to know who's right outside that top 10? Number 11 is Oklahoma State. Number 12 is Baylor. Oklahoma's on a bye this week. You know who they play next week? At Baylor. You know where they close the season? At Oklahoma State. If Oklahoma wins those 2 games, guess who moves ahead of Cincinnati? And I'm not even saying that it's unjustified. All I'm saying is this. 5 is kind of that, again, that carrot dangling in front of them. Just win. You'll be fine. No, Cincinnati's going to need some help along the way. One, best thing that can happen. First of all, best thing that can happen for them, Notre Dame needs to keep winning. If Notre Dame finishes 11-1, that is the best thing that can happen to Cincinnati. 2, definitely need Oregon to lose. 3, need some chaos in the Big Ten where there's only going to be one Big Ten team good enough to get in. If Michigan State loses to Ohio State but wins out and finishes 11-1, you could see the scenario Michigan State gets in at number 4. And then 3, they definitely need Alabama to lose. So I don't want to belabor the point. We'll talk about this in the coming weeks, but I'm just saying Cincinnati, I think on paper, oh, they're number 5. That's so great. Good for you. A little pat on the head. No. Be careful if you're a Cincinnati fan. Watch your back. Committee's out to get you. Let me also say this, though. I'm all over the place today, by the way. Let me say this about the committee. If I'm going to crush them because I disagree with Alabama at number 2, and if I'm going to crush them because I disagree that Cincinnati should be number 5, I would have had Cincinnati at number 3 behind Georgia and Michigan State. Then I also must say this. I do give the committee credit for putting Ohio State behind Oregon in the initial rankings. Now, if Ohio State runs the table, do I really believe that Oregon is going to stay ahead of them? I don't know that I do, but this was the right move. And it's really funny because on my Fox Sports radio show on Saturday night, my partner and I, Jason Martin, started talking about this. And initially, I didn't even think it was a conversation. I kind of just said, hey, yeah, when those rankings come out, where would you have Ohio State and Oregon? And in my head, I'm like, you got to have Oregon ahead of Ohio State, right? And he kind of said, well, you obviously have to have Ohio State ahead of Oregon, right? And I said, really? And he said, well, yeah, look at Oregon had a bad loss. They haven't been playing well. Ohio State's rolling everybody. And I vehemently disagree with Jason. And by the way, everyone's entitled to their opinion. I disagreed with him on air. I told him that. I'm not disrespecting him on my own podcast, nothing like that. Love Jason, love working with him. But I can't really see the argument, especially this early. If you have two teams that have one loss apiece and one of those teams lost to the other one, I don't know how you have that team ahead of you, because to me, that would set a very bad precedent going forward in college football. And the reason is pretty simple. If Oregon doesn't even get credit for beating Ohio State, if Ohio State still gets to pass Oregon after losing to them, I think it undermines the entire process. And it's really funny because I'm a little bit of a historian of sports. I think people forget. But if you go back to the BCS era, there was 2 or 3 examples where teams had head-to-head losses to another team, and that team ultimately ended up surpassing them in the poll at some point. The most famous instance of this, 2000. Miami loses early in the year to Washington. Florida State loses to Miami. Florida State jumps Miami in the final computers. They play Oklahoma in the national championship game. Oklahoma wins. Miami destroys Florida in the Sugar Bowl. And Miami believes, and I've talked to those guys. I've talked to Santana Moss about it, a lot of them, that they were the best team in college football. So I truly believed that because we have the human element to it, that they would put Oregon ahead of Ohio State. But I do believe it was the right decision, especially this early in the process. If Oregon continues to sputter, if they can't get out of their own way, that changes the narrative. If Ohio State beats Michigan State 51-3 when they play and then follow it up 63-6 against Michigan, that changes the narrative like it did in 2014 when Ohio State jumped a bunch of teams. But right now, I am just telling you it was the right decision by the committee. I do actually give them a lot of credit because I think that it's only fair if you're going to schedule these tough games, you have to be rewarded if you win them. Finally, let me just say this. Give the committee credit for something else. I thought Oklahoma at number 8 was about right. Now, I would have had them a spot or two higher. I think they deserve to be ahead of Michigan. But what I would also say about Oklahoma, the eye test is a real thing, and Oklahoma hasn't really looked that good. And we've gone through Oklahoma time and time and time again on this podcast. I'm not going to spend all that much time on it just because I don't think it really warrants that much time on it. But Oklahoma is an improving team, and they're a different team under Caleb Williams. But if you look at their wins, again, 5 points over Tulane, 7 points over Nebraska, 3 points over West Virginia, 6 points over K-State, touchdown against Texas, take care of TCU, take care of Kansas in a close game, and take care of Texas Tech. However, like I said, if you look at the Big 12 standings, Oklahoma's first place, Oklahoma State, Baylor tied for second, Iowa State tied in third place. Oklahoma hasn't played any of the 3 best teams in the conference, and right now they have beaten a grand total of 2 teams that have winning records this season. Kansas State, which is 5-3, and Texas Tech, which is 5-4. Kansas is terrible. TCU just fired its coach. Texas Tech has a winning record, and they just fired their coach. Texas is 4-4, and West Virginia is 4-4 as well. So those are my 4 big takeaways. Listen, I know it's all going to change. I know it's all going to it'll be different, right? But at the same time, my 4 big takeaways are Alabama at number 2 makes no sense. Disappointed that Cincinnati is at number 5, but not surprised. Oregon over Ohio State is the right thing. And then finally, Oklahoma at number